Well, good evening to you all. My name is Steve. I'm a kindergarten teacher in Santa Cruz, California. And thank you for spending a Monday evening with me. I'll try to keep it concise and succinct and hope that you all go away with some inspiration and new ideas about your relating with young children. I'm going to kind of walk you through some ideas I have. And let's just get started. So this is the theme: to deepen our relationship with young children, to enhance our communication skills, and to further our understanding of them and their stage of development. So I'm mostly speaking about children in the before first grade range, so up to 7-ish. But a lot of this that I'll be speaking about applies to children of any age. In fact, a lot of it applies to adults and our relationship with adults. So my hope is that we all take a couple of steps, positive directional steps towards becoming more conscious in our interactions with everyone and less reactive. And that's a big, big hope. So let's just go right into it. I think of 5 important principles when I think about the relationship with young children. And those principles really, for me, determine how I interact with children. And I should say, to start out our time together, I'm going to share with you a lot of my ideas. And I have a tendency to be very enthusiastic and to, it might seem that what I think about something is the only way to think about something. And I am fully aware that that is not the case, that there are many ways to think about anything. But my enthusiasm sometimes might give you the impression that what I'm saying is exactly how you should think about things also. So I just want to give that little cautionary note. So these 5 realms, to me, really are the compass by which I navigate my way amongst the world of young children. And some of this compass helps me navigate my world of human beings in general. And so I'd like to kind of go through these to give us a framework, a structure for thinking. These 5 realms are the development of the neurology of the human being, but also we could include the development of the physical body in general. But particularly tonight, we're going to focus on the development of neurology. Connected to it, but not identical, is the development of the experience of self. So, of course, as adults, we are clearly aware of what we mean when we say self. What is the boundary where our self ends and everything that isn't self begins? But young children don't have such clarity, and newborns have zero experience of that. And so we'll get into all of these 5 principles, but I just want to lay them out for you. Another one of these principles is that the primary way that young children learn is imitation. And we so easily forget that. But that is how they learn. For better or worse, the things that we do and the ways that we do them really imprint onto the children and become the things that they do and the ways that they do them. Now, I could go off on a tangent. It would be very easy to go off onto a tangent to consider the various faculties that a human being has. But in brief, I'll say that once we have a perception of something, there's really three ways that a human being can interact with that perception. And the perception could be with something that we see. It could be with something that, as an adult, something that we read, something that someone tells us, something that we hear, something that our inner organs, our physical organs are telling us through signals that are sent through our neurology. But there's three ways we can respond to those perceptions, to any type of perception or thought. Well, one way is thought. We can think about things. We can have ideas about things. We can ruminate. We can voyage in our inner realm in relation to the thing that we're perceiving. And that, you could say, is the primary way for adults to interact with what we perceive. We think about stuff. Another way that we can interact with our perceptions is through what we feel about them. I feel happy about this thing that I'm perceiving. I feel sad about it. Anger rises up in relation to this experience. So we can have a whole inner experience of the feelings that arise in relation to the perception. And the third way we can interact with our perception is by doing something. And I like to use the word will. Our will, or will, is that way that we either intentionally and consciously or unconsciously engage in activity. So if you lift your arm up and try to touch the top of your head, that is an exercise of will. If you see some part of your personality that you're not happy with and you want to change it, that is an aspect of your will. If you determine that there's something that you want to focus your attention on, whether it's in a meditative activity or even in your daily life, to put your attention on something or to concentrate on a particular thing, all of that is an activity of your will. If you want to learn something, or I should say it a different way, for you to learn something, your will has to be engaged. So here we are, we're sitting in our homes, probably, I'm not sure if you're all at your homes, but we're sitting in our separate little spaces, and I'm offering some ideas, but I can't actually teach you anything. But it's possible that you might learn something, but you will only learn something if your will engages. And in this tonight, your will would be engaging in the realm of ideas. And so for all of us, of any age, all learning is an activity in which our own will is engaged. Now, I mentioned there's three ways we can interact with our perceiving. We can think about it, we can have feelings about it, or we can take action. And for the young child, their main realm of interacting with perception is action. So they are very much a will being, you could say, whereas adults tend to be more thinking beings, and teenagers stereotypically could be thought of as feeling beings. But as a general idea, young children are very much will oriented. So that's the general compass. Now let's go to the a little more into these 5 principles. Now, I mentioned that neurological development is particularly important and what we'll be focusing on this evening. But to be clear, the organs, the physical organs of the young child are not mature at birth. all of the organs, the kidney, the liver, the lungs, the spleen, the gallbladder, all of these organs that are so intimately involved in this whole process of human life are not mature at birth. They have a ways to grow in their size, but also in their functioning, and particularly the human brain. The human brain has a lot of developing to do. And in the earliest years of life, the human brain has its most profound and significant period of growth. It literally is the formative years for the brain. And I want to mention now, because I'll keep coming back to it, this idea about the human brain that was initially brought forward by a man named Paul MacLean, who was he worked at the National Institutes of Health. And he has this theory that the human brain has three significant systems that interact in the way the human being functions. And these three systems develop at different times and offer different possibilities. And these three systems are composed of many different parts of the human brain, but together they form a functional system. And the three systems are commonly called the reptile brain, which is the parts of the brain that are really the most ancient, the earliest part of brain, you could say, to evolve in living creatures. The second, or a second system is often called the mammalian brain or the limbic system. And that arose in the evolution of life on Earth. It arose with the mammals. Oddly enough, it got the name mammalian brain. And finally, there's you could say the neo-mammalian brain, some people say, or the frontal lobes or the prefrontal cortex, but it's the most recently developed part of brain in the course of evolution. And so I use the term prefrontal cortex mostly, or for short, PFC. So I went through these other parts, and I left out actually one of the principles that I just want to mention now, and we're going to go deep into this principle, because this to me really is important. And the other principle is that most human actions, or perhaps all human actions, are motivated either by need or desire. So we are trying to get our needs met or fulfill the desires that we have from almost everything that we do. Or some people would say everything that we do is motivated by these two principles of fulfilling our needs or satisfying our desires. And how we do that are the strategies that we use. And as adults, we have the possibility of consciously choosing strategies, but young children, not so much. And so they are very much in the realm of habits. And that's not to say that adults don't have a lot of habits, and we certainly do. And I once read that approximately 40% of our waking time, our day waking hours, are consumed by habit activities that we do. So a habit would be, for instance, when you take a shower, the way that you wash your hair each time. You don't have to think about it. You do it the same way every time. A habit would be the way you drive a car. When you were learning how to drive that car, you had to be very conscious and think, oh, put the key in there and turn the key this way, and then put your hand on this thing and put that foot over there and do this with your foot and just a little and do this and that. And it had to be very conscious because you didn't know how to do it. But once you learned how, then driving became a habit. And when we have a habit, we don't have to be conscious in the doing of that habit. And that's a really significant thing. It's a really important thing to keep in mind, that when we are engaged in a habit, even though it is an activity of our will, it is not consciously directed by us. So let's go into the neurological development a little bit. The reptile brain is the part of our brain, this most ancient part of our brain, where the survival of this being, of this creature, resides. So this part of the brain is, the tools of this part of the brain are fight, flight, and freeze. So it's all about defense and protecting and maintaining life. And this part of the brain is fully developed by age 2. And this part of the brain is the fastest functioning, or the fastest, or I should say the quickest signal processing part of the brain. The signal that goes to the signals that go to the reptile brain are processed hundreds of times faster than signals that go to any other part of the human brain. And that is important, and that can be a problem, and we will get to that later. The limbic system, or the mammalian brain, is the part of our brain where we experience feelings. It's where sentience lives. It's where we have learning, where our memory is. And this part of the brain is developed by the time someone turns 7 years old. Now, it's interesting, as an aside, if you're part of a Waldorf school, or if your child goes to a Waldorf school, or if you happen to live in Sweden or some other places, children don't go to first grade until their limbic system is mature. When is it mature? At age 7. So it's a very interesting confluence of things, that the maturity of the limbic system coincides with this idea of waiting, or at least compared to normal common practice in North America, waiting a little longer to go to first grade. The prefrontal cortex is where what we call executive function resides. So these are things like planning and reasoning and impulse control and being able to focus your attention. And this part of the brain as a functional system isn't mature, isn't fully mature until someone is in their later 20s. So first takeaway, hopefully first takeaway for you all in this evening is the young child does not have access to these capacities of planning, reasoning, impulse control, focused attention for many years to come. The young child's prefrontal cortex is very, very immature at age 3, at age 5, at age 6. That this part of the human brain is not mature until the later 20s. So if we could all remember that, and always all remember that, we would have already changed the world in a significant way. Because then when we are having a challenging interaction with a young child, we wouldn't resort to telling them to pay attention. We wouldn't resort to explaining and explaining and explaining the consequences of the action that they took. We wouldn't try to go to the cause and effect reasoning that we so quickly and automatically go to. So important point number 1 is that the child's prefrontal cortex where executive functions reside is not mature for another 20 years at least. I mentioned something I like to think about is this experience of self, or self-awareness would be a better way to say it. The newborn infant does not yet have this experience of what is self and what is other. The newborn has this experience that all of their sense experiences are just part of what make up their consciousness. And it's a little by little experience over years and years and years that the child starts to have this awareness that they are a separate self from all those around them and from all else that is around them also. And I think that it's connected to the early stages of the developing of this prefrontal cortex, because this is where the intellect also resides. And the intellect, while being a great gift towards solving problems and solutions and understanding and so forth, the intellect is also something that separates us from all that is around us. So when we're born, we don't have intellect and we don't have an experience of self. And as the one arises, so does the other. They go hand in hand. And how this experience of self arises, besides it being related to the development of the intellect, is through the sense experiences that the child has. Because in a one way of looking at it, the child is like a sense organ. The child is completely a sense organ. Maria Montessori described the child as having an absorbent mind, like a sponge, is how I think about it. So all of the sense experiences that that child has are experienced, and they're part of how neural pathways are developed. And they're part of how the child experiences things that are them and things that are not them. So it's through these sense experiences that the child starts to feel like a separate self. And on the one hand, we all need to feel like a separate self so that we can recognize where we have agency and the actions that we take and so forth. But the development of this separate self experience is also a very sad and lonely experience in a way. And a lot of times, by the time someone's prefrontal cortex is fully developed, they start to sort of step back and feel this loneliness, you could say, that arises with this separation of self that we have. We are all individual selves, but it doesn't feel so good, because what we long for, what we need, is connection. And so oftentimes people in their 30s decide to embark on some sort of spiritual path or another so that they can regain that feeling of connection. And so this developing of the intellect is a disconnecting force, and this developing of separate self experience is also a disconnecting force. So you can be in your 30s and you can have a partner and you can have colleagues at work and you can have your circle of friends, and you can also feel they just don't really get you, and you're really alone in your unique challenges of your life, because you're just you, and no one else really can fully experience you. So we long for that connection, and in fact, connection is a human need. It's a basic human need. Imitation is so important to recognize as the learning tool of the young child. And one way you know how important it is if you think about other creatures, most other creatures, For instance, a newborn horse. I like to mention a horse. When a foal is born, a newborn horse, you could take the mother horse away from it, and you could take all horses away from it so that it doesn't have any horses in its world. Of course, you're going to need to feed it, but already on the first day, that newborn horse can stand and walk like a horse. And without all of the other horses, without any horses in that newborn horse's world, that newborn horse will grow up into a horse that moves like a horse, that walks and runs like a horse, and that makes sounds like a horse, that speaks, if you will, speaks like a horse. A human being doesn't get to do that. A newborn human being, if you took away all human beings and you somehow managed to feed it and keep it clean and so forth, it would never learn how to walk or to speak. Walking and speaking, and in fact, thinking, require a community of human beings. We cannot learn, we will not learn how to walk, how to speak without human beings to copy. So I'll tell you a funny experience I had, or I think it's funny and kind of embarrassing, but when I was younger, and my mom was still alive, people used to tell me that I walked the way my mom walks. And I thought, that's kind of ridiculous. I noticed the way my mom walked, and I didn't think I walked like that. And so one day I was walking with my mom, and we were walking towards a building that had a very kind of mirror-like window into it. And I saw these two people walking together that at first I didn't recognize as being me and my mom. But I saw these two people, and I noted in my head how similarly they were walking. And when I figured a few steps later, figured out that that was me and my mom, it was a little shocking, but it really gave me an insight into, it's not only that I learned to walk from the human beings around me, but I learned to walk the way the human beings around me walk, or at least one particular one of them, the one who I was around the most when I was a young child. So imitation is the basic mechanism for learning. It's the way the will is functioning in the young child. Now, there's a recent discovery in neurology, recent in terms of a couple of decades, I'd say, and that's something called mirror neurons. And mirror neurons are something in your brain that when you observe someone, these mirror neurons participate with the activity that that person is doing. So when someone is speaking, our neurons are firing, and we're almost wanting to say the words that they're saying. But as an adult, we can stop ourselves. We can have this sort of signaling from our mirror neurons, but we can choose not to do it. But as a young child, it's almost a compulsion. We must do the things that we are experiencing, that we are perceiving, because our mirror neurons are telling us to do that, and we don't have a way to filter out that information as a young child. And so that's something to think about. It's a neurological thing as well as a will activity. So I mentioned needs. Needs, some of you probably have heard of Marshall Rosenberg, who was the one who articulated a certain way of communicating, or he articulated actually some basic principles of human communication and offered ways to lift up our our communication style, or really what he offered is a way to reframe the way we experience things, so that in the reframing of it and then describing this reframed way of looking at our experiences, we have taken away some aggressive qualities that just live in most people's speaking. But what Marshall Rosenberg said, what he developed was called nonviolent communication. And in recent years, Marshall has passed away, but in recent years, it's more often called compassionate communication. Marshall said that anything anyone does is motivated by needs. Anything anyone does ever is motivated by needs. So that's something to think about. The most basic human needs are safety and connection. I would throw into that another need is that sometimes our desires get satisfied. So you could say safety, some satisfaction, and connection. So safety means physical safety. Safety means emotional safety, not being teased, not being verbally, I hate this word, but I'm going to use it, verbally bullied or physically. And connection means warmth and love. And these are human needs. Every one of us has these needs. And as adults, it's our responsibility to take responsibility for our own needs, to make sure that these needs are met. But as adults who either are parents or teachers, it's our responsibility to make sure these needs are met for the young child. So that means we have to create a world of safety for them, physical safety, emotional safety, and we have to do that without being hovering around them, intervening all the time, and we'll get into this in a little while. And we have to give them true warmth and true love. And these are needs. And if we don't fulfill these needs, or if we don't create a space in which the child's needs are fulfilled, the child will grow up with a lot of challenges that they will have to overcome through deep self-reflection, going to counselors, or whatever ways that they will be able to find, if they so choose, to heal this situation that they had to have an early childhood without having their needs met for them by adults. Now, I don't mean that the child is never going to break an arm, or the child is never going to get angry, or you're not going to get angry with them. All that stuff happens, but that we fulfill these needs in a pretty good way most of the time, that's what young children need. There's no one can be perfect. And even if you think you're being perfect, you might do what the child wasn't really needing or desiring anyway. So we do the best that we can, which is fulfilling these needs pretty much most of the time. So how I think about this, how it all kind of fits together, is how can we create situations so that the young child can take hold of these situations in a way that they can learn something? How can we foster situations where true learning can arise? And it's really challenging because as adults with our fully developed prefrontal cortex, we think it's going to come to this place where we explain stuff to them, instruct them, and teach them things. And it simply doesn't work that way. I remember this one kind of chilling quote I read in a lecture, in a lecture from Steiner, where he described when we push the children into activities, intellectual type activities that they're not really ripe for, we are potentially creating physical issues later in life. Now, I can't say that I can see that direct relationship myself personally, but that idea resonates with me, that if we don't really meet the children at the stage that they're at, and instead push them or prematurely push them. It's like if you've ever bought flowers that were grown in a hothouse and then you wanted to try to grow them outdoors, it's not easy. That those plants struggle. They struggle a lot. So that's the question. How can we let the will of the child take hold so that they can learn something for themselves? The child has to do the learning. I could go into this idea of rhythm, how important it is to create a rhythmic life for young children. And the easy place to start is to have meal times at the same time and bedtime at the same time. And then the rest of your day can kind of fall into place. And I always say, if you have to wake your child up in the morning to go to wherever you're going to have them go, then they went to bed too late. So getting them to bed early enough so that they can wake up in the morning without you waking them up. Also, just as an aside, there's a great book that that I recommend. It's called The 7 O'Clock Bedtime. And it really goes into the importance of sleep and how much sleep young children need. But all that is for another time. The gist of it is, though, when you create a routine to your day, a rhythm, then you've already eliminated a lot of conflicts. Because, for instance, if every day you have dinner and then the routine is dinner, clear the table, do the dishes together, by the way, children can help do dishes, do the dishes, then bath, then brush teeth, then in bed with the story, and then good night. And if that's your routine every day, then the child isn't going to say, well, I don't want to brush my teeth, or I don't want to take a bath, because it's just what you do every day. And once it becomes what you do every day, then there's no conflict about doing those activities. So it becomes a habit. And it's really helpful to think about young children as habit creatures. And the more habits that we can create, the more habits we create that are habits that we have been encouraging and hoping take hold, then the less conflicted our life will be with them. Of course, bad habits arise, and then what do you do? And we'll talk about that. Okay, so let's go into some ideas about communicating. I'll make this a little bigger in case it's hard to see. So this is a little cartoon I found a long time ago. And if you, in case you can't read it, the larger person in the chair is saying, now, sweetheart, you know it's not very grown up to spill your ice cream all over the couch, and it's not nice to leave toys everywhere so that I have to pick them up. And the smaller person who is standing is saying in their head, or is hearing what the person is saying, blah, 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 ice cream, blah, 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 toys. And I think sometimes cartoons can be so enlightening. And I think of this as one of those. We all, I'm certain, myself included, have found ourselves talking to the children and noticing that most of what we're saying is not being received. So the first step, I would say, the first step in becoming a more effective communicator with young children is the same first step as becoming a more effective communicator with any human being, which is trying to become aware of our own habits in how we communicate. Do we interrupt people? Do we let the other person know that we're truly listening to them when we're speaking? Do we say, well, some of the specifics I will want to lead you through questioning in a few minutes as we go on. So becoming aware of our own communication is the first step towards becoming a more effective communicator. You have to know what you do so that you can decide if that suits your own needs or if you want to change it. One thing adults do, as noted in this cartoon, is we speak so much. We speak too much. So one thing is to speak less. Now, I'm going to tell you something that I know, in fact, it's very difficult, but I offer this to you as a practice, and I have found it to be amazing. So when you have something important to communicate to another adult, I remember Marshall Rosenberg saying this: if you have something important to say to another adult, kind of say it in little packages of no more than 40 words at a time. So an adult, Marshall Rosenberg said, could handle 40 words. They could process them. They could you could check in to see if they got that 40-word package and then move on if you have more to say. Well, I suggest that with young children, let's shrink that 40 words way down and let's get it down to a dozen words. What is the important thing you're trying to get across to the young child? And before you open your mouth to say it, distill it down to just a few words. I'll give you an example, and we're going to come back to this example numerous times in the next 20, 30 minutes. One child takes something from another child. Now, the child that took it is happy. The other child who had it and doesn't have it anymore is not so happy. So you could say like this: it's her turn now, and you can have a turn next. 11 words. It's her turn now, and you can have a turn next. Or 10 words and leave out the and. And you don't need to say one single word more. That gets across the essence of what you really need to say to them. Another element of adult speaking is, as I'm doing this evening, because I feel like I don't want to keep you up all night, so I'm speaking fast. And if I were speaking to young children, I would be speaking more slowly. And part of that is because the way the brain of a young child functions is they can't process as many words per minute as adults can. So speak more slowly when you're speaking with young children. Be truthful with young children, or actually be truthful in general. So if you say to the child, yes, you can have ice cream on the way home, you have to provide the ice cream on the way home. Or if you say, no, we're not having any ice cream until after dinner, then if they start saying, oh, please, oh, I want ice cream. Oh, please. Oh, you never let me. Oh, daddy always lets me. Oh, please give me some ice cream. And if suddenly your no ice cream turns into, okay, we'll get ice cream, then they're learning something from you, which is that when you say something, it isn't necessarily true. Now, it's another thing, completely a different thing. If you say, no, we're not going to do this, but then you think about it and you acknowledge something like this, I said we were not going to do that, but I've changed my mind, and now I've decided that we are going to do that. That is a different thing. Then you're acknowledging your process in changing the decision. So consistency in what we say and consistency in following through. As I mentioned before, example rather than instruction. This is really hard to do things that you would be happy if the children copied you, to say things that you would be happy if the children copied you. Like the example I gave a minute ago, it's your turn, it's her turn now, and you can have a turn next. Well, eventually, one of the children might start imitating what I said. And perhaps it's the child who has the toy. As the other child approaches, that child might say, "It's my turn now. You can have a turn next." Or perhaps the child who, in the original scenario, took the toy will walk up to the child who now has the toy and say, "Can I have a turn next?" And those are ways that we use imitation as a tool. We offer things in front of the children that we would be happy for them to imitate. And I'm going to say something maybe hard to accept, but I really think that the words good and bad, right and wrong, should and shouldn't, appropriate and not appropriate, okay and not okay, are not useful words. All of those words are judgments. They're valued judgments, or their opinions. They're not somebody's inner truth of what's happening. And I think, in a way, one of the biggest problems of our time is that human beings don't offer the example to each other of being real. And what I mean by being real is revealing what really lives inside you. What do you feel about something? What do you really think? What are your thoughts about it? No, not what your opinion is, but what do you think about this thing? What is your truth about it? So, for instance, the child, the example that I gave, one child has a toy, the other child takes the toy. Is that did the child who took the toy, if we consider them, was that a good or a bad thing to do? Was it right or wrong? Was it something they shouldn't do? It was not appropriate and it was not okay. That's where we go in how we frame situations. Our mind goes to this place of determining fault or valuing action based on these opinions. The reality is, or a reality is, the child who went over saw the toy and desired that toy. And so the child went over with this desire, grabbed hold of this toy that they desired, and walked away with it. So from one point of view, this was a very good way to get the thing that you desire. So if you want to say good or bad, it was a good thing for that child to do to get the thing that he wanted. But the reality is, or another level of the reality, is that the child who had the toy didn't like that the toy was taken away. So to me, the most basic core truth about this is this child didn't like what happened. So is there a way to resolve this situation that in which the child that didn't like what happened has their experience honored also? So we'll get to this. We'll come back to this a little bit, but I want to plant a seed that these words are not useful, and maybe there's no such thing as these words anyway. No isn't a bad word. No is a word that we need to use. It's a way we create boundaries. Boundaries create safety. And within this web of safety that we create for a child, they can feel, and then they can explore and experiment in ways that they can develop self-confidence and self-reliance. In fact, children expect these boundaries from us. And without this kind of guidance, we end up with insecure children who are confused. They don't have the prefrontal cortex. When we give them too much choice, they're also insecure. They don't have the prefrontal cortex. So they need us to really guide them, of course. When we ask the child to remember, well, do you remember that a few minutes ago I explained how the part of the brain that's involved in memory isn't really mature until about age 7. So memories recalled on demand isn't really possible before then. Memory arises whenever it happens to, and parents of young children know that it often arises around bedtime. I don't know why that is, but the child is relaxing and things that happen during the day bubble up at bedtime. But on-demand recall is not ready yet. So when you say, oh, remember I told you not to do this, or remember we talked about this yesterday, not useful, not useful. I like to tell my own colleagues not to call the children friends. Or their friends, like, oh, hello, friends, says the teacher to the children. Because the relationship of friend to friend is very different from the relationship of parent to child, or the relationship of teacher to child, of young, teacher of young child to young child. So to really think about it, we want to be friendly with children, but not be their friends, so to speak. For any of you who might be connected to Waldorf schools, you might have taken up this lingo. This is something that really bothers me. When people tell, let's say you're eating and everyone is sitting down and you want everyone to be sitting down until everyone is done, and you sing the ending of the meal song, and then everyone can get up. And you say to the child who gets up and is not sitting as you wish them to be, in your stern voice, you say to the child, you may sit down, or you may do such and such, or you may not do such and such. And to me, when we use the word may, it implies that there's a choice. What I think what we really are meaning is, I want you to sit down, or even you will sit down, rather than you can decide if you want to sit down or not. And to me, it's also related to the use of this word that a lot of grown-ups do with young children. I'm bringing you to kindergarten and I see, oh, you're playing now. And the parent is thinking, it's time for me to make my escape. And they go over to their child and they say, I'm going to leave now, okay? And it's like we are offering to the child the choice of whether we leave or not. When in fact, what we're saying is, this is what's going to happen. I'm leaving now and I'll pick you up at story time. So as I mentioned, to really become more aware of the habits that we have in our own communication, it's really one of the key things that we can do. When we are asking a child, do you want to do such and such, or will you sit down, or whenever it's a question that we are asking to them, we have to be able to accept that they say no to us. Otherwise, we're not really asking them a question. We're making a demand and we're pretending it's a question. We're using question-like words, but it's really a demand. In a general way, I would say the more often, or the more children feel that warmth of connection, that interest and enthusiasm about the things that the children do, and our acceptance of them and our appreciation of them, our warmth and love, the more they feel that, the more likely they're they are to do the things that we want them to do anyway. And it's really founded on these steps, you could say, of interest and recognition of the child. And when we create this world for them, this environment where they feel safe and they feel that warmth of our connection, then they can begin to trust us. And trust isn't something that just happens. It's something that develops based on experiences. So we have to, I think we have to set as our goal creating this experience, this environment in which the children develop trust in us, or in which we act in such ways that the children can trust us. And perhaps that's something that ought to be considered more. All of this that I've been speaking about really is a subversive introduction to the real essence of it, which is we have to do education on ourselves. We have to develop ourselves so that we can contain ourselves, so that we have the self-discipline necessary to have experiences that don't go the way we want them to go, and to not lose our cool, to not lose our mind, so to speak. Or in neurological lingo, you could say to not lose the possibility of the capacities that the prefrontal cortex offer and fall into our reactive patterns, which do not live in prefrontal cortex. They live in a kind of relationship between the reptile brain and the limbic system. That's where our habits are, in these other parts of the brain. A habit is a strategy that has become conditioned behavior. So perhaps when you were little, as now you're an adult, but when you were a child, you observed how the other people in your world interacted, and you saw that some people growl and make a lot of noise and are aggressive, and they get what they want. So you adopted that strategy, and it became a habit in you. And so now as an adult, perhaps when something doesn't go the way you want it to go, you growl and you roar and you are aggressive to get what you want. Or perhaps you observed someone who pouted and cried and then got what they wanted that way. And so that's your pattern. When things are going rough, you fall into that pattern. So we have to see these things in ourselves so that we can decide whether or not we want these patterns to be the way we offer human behavior to our young children, because they will take them up as their own ways of being. You know, if you had a child who had an object in their hand and dropped it, and they casually said as it fell to the ground, "Oh shit." On the one hand, you might get very upset. They're using bad language, and you know that's one way people describe that. On the other hand, you might think, wow, their language development is so incredible. They're using those words in a perfect context, in a perfect application of those words. But however you feel about what they just did, the way they became able to do what they just did was by copying somebody, most likely you or their other parent. So we have to look at ourselves and not get angry with the children for the things they do, because most of the things they do, they've learned from us. So just quickly quote Margaret Meyercourt. I know at least some of you know who she was. She was a kindergarten teacher for many, many years, and a trainer of other kindergarten teachers, and went around the world giving many lectures to teachers and parents. And one thing she said, which I really hear her sitting on my shoulder and whispering in my ear all the time, this: unless I develop myself, what right do I have to stand before the children? I think that applies to teachers who are paid to stand before the children. It's our vocation. So we must develop ourselves. It's part of our vocation, whether or not we recognize it at first. It really is a responsibility for a teacher to develop themselves. And it's less clear that this really is a responsibility for parents too. But it really is, because if we recognize that imitation is the way young children learn, then we have to recognize that the reaction patterns that we have will be taken up by the children, will be taken in by the children. They will imitate us in those ways. And so our unexamined and untransformed reaction patterns become the reason our children, when they become adults, go to psychologists and counselors and other kinds of therapies. So for adults, step one is understanding yourself, observing and understanding. 2, deciding if you have an intention to change any of this. And 3, changing it. Changing habits is hard. I'll give you that. Changing habits is very hard. Any of you who ever were smokers or didn't want to always have to eat that last piece of cake that you know is waiting in the refrigerator, like not doing those things is hard. Now, all of these patterns are related to neurology, and I'll just quickly explain how that is. All of the habits, well, our reptile brain is responsible for survival. So long ago, millions of years ago, when there were large reptiles like dinosaurs that had big teeth and liked to eat things, it was really important that we were really tuned in to our survival part of our brain, so that we knew where threats were and how to identify threats. And then if there is such a dangerous thing, a threat, we knew when do we run, when do we hide, or when do we fight it. So when something happens that you don't like, your neurology treats it as a threat. And so the threat, as I mentioned, the reptile part of our brain is the fastest part of our brain. It receives signals and processes so quickly. And so when you perceive something as a threat, which could be translated as somebody is doing something that you don't like, then your pattern rises. Should you fight them? Should you run away from them? Should you freeze? And of course, we all have sort of different tonal qualities and colorations of these 3 things, but we all do them, or we all do one of them primarily. And for us to not do those habits, we have to keep our prefrontal cortex engaged. And this is the tricky thing. So how do we do that? One thing is a mantra I like to share with you all. And the mantra is an acronym, and it's WAIT. And so if you can program your own mind to, before you start speaking, to ask yourself, what am I thinking? Wait, what am I thinking? Before you speak, then that would be a big game changer. If before you open your mouth to speak, or if we all did this, before we speak, we think, so that what comes out of our mouth is something that we have thought through. Sometimes I like to think of this acronym WAIT as, why am I talking? And with young children, I think we have to consider, do we intervene too often or too quickly? Do we need to intervene? Why am I talking now? Because if we don't let the children try to work it out, then they're not going to learn something. Remember, this learning is a will activity, and the will is only an own will. My will can't teach you anything, but your will can. So when the children are having a frustrating moment, a challenging interaction, when do we intervene? I think is a better question. Not until the children get a chance to try to work it out, because then they will learn something. I want to offer this as an ideal that we need to find ways to find our own inner quiet, our own inner stillness, so that we create a space in which our prefrontal cortex or our evolved higher self based on intention and thought can take hold. And so finding ways to create this quiet and stillness, one way I like anyway, is meditation. And this is a wonderful meditation that Rudolf Steiner offered about finding this strong and quiet space of will inside you. I should say, anyone who's interested in these slides, I'm happy to send them to you. I'll give you my email in a little bit. So this is a wonderful meditation, not just to say the words, but to in a way to let the words invoke images in you, so you can see the movement of the pictures that are being described, because it's an activity. It's not just a repetition, but it's really the will is activity. So we need to engage our will with these words to help us change our neurology towards quietness and stillness. There's an amazing neurologist / Buddhist teacher named Rick Hanson. Some of you might have heard of him. And Rick Hanson offers some activities that he describes as changing your neurology. And basically, it's like this. We put what we want to be in there to displace the reactive patterns that exist. The thing is, when we have a good experience, it kind of flows through our consciousness, like a little bit like the way Rick Hanson describes it, like food on a Teflon pan. It doesn't stick to it. It just goes through. But the difficult experiences that we have, it's like Velcro. And so we have to find ways to help the good experiences to enhance the positive qualities, so they really stick with us, so they become part of us. So whatever tools you can find to be able to stay connected to your own calm center, it's really important, because responding rather than reacting is the key. Reacting is, I've called this talk Connecting with Young Children, or connecting. When we are reacting, we are not present to connect with anyone. I think that's a really important thing. I want to say it again. If you're in a reactive mode, you are not present. Your consciousness is not fully there. You are reacting, which is a habit. And in a habit, our consciousness isn't present. So we have to learn how to stay present so that we can respond. And the responding has to be based on the needs of the moment, which means we have to engage our prefrontal cortex. So we have to not see our experiences as threatening to us. Also, we have to think about the situation and the possibility that we do have an advanced neurology, so we can consider things like creating a rhythm of the day, so that the child doesn't have times when they're hungry or tired and they get upset, and then their being upset triggers us, and then we fall into our patterns, and nothing good is going to happen from that. So before you get into that place of nagging or reminding or criticizing, telling someone what to do, or putting in your 2 cents, explaining and instructing and talking, use this little acronym, WAIT. And just as a guiding principle, listen more than you talk. It's a really basic and important thing to think about. So what happens when there's a conflict? And this is the core of it all. The basic reality, the truth of a situation, what we call conflict, is someone is doing something that the other person doesn't want, or someone is not doing something that the other person wants them to do. Either way. And so when we look at the ways humans interact, you can easily see there are two main techniques to get someone to do the thing you want them to do. One is to threaten them, and the other is to bribe them. So commonly these are called sticks and carrots. Now, our parents had their technique of getting us to do what we wanted. Now, I remember when I was a child, my mom used the threat of my dad. Oh, you don't want your dad to know what you're doing, so don't do that anymore. So I think it's important to, first of all, be aware of, do we use threats and bribes, or which one do we use most? And when we're using those, are we aware that we're using them? Now, I'm not saying never use those. I'm just saying use them consciously if you need to use them. But remember that the way you do things will be the way your child does things, because they imitate our example. So often threats and bribes are used so that people can get other people to do what they want. And a twist on that is shaming and blaming. Shaming and blaming are also used to get people to do what we want. And shaming and blaming are based on this ancient idea that whatever happened that wasn't what we wanted, it must be somebody's fault. And so we have to figure out whose fault it is, and then we can blame them. And in the blaming of them, we can make them feel ashamed, because they should have done the thing that we wanted. They should be ashamed of themselves. And do you do any of those things? Possibly. Do I do any of those things? Sometimes. So, as I keep saying, step one, look at yourself. We are the key in all of this. It's not that we're going to change the children or tell them to do something different. It's we're going to change us. And in the changing of us, the result will be that children are copying these changes in us. Here is a child showing the parents what happens when you interact with your child in a certain way. And the child is telling the parents, you just go in the other room because my dolly went to bed without a cookie that was under the couch, and then I ate it so I can play with my friend Carla because she's a bad girl, but she can play with my toys, and you go to work when I have chicken for lunch, so you made me very mad. So, of course, the child is imitating the tone and the style, but the content got a little confused. But of course, the child doesn't have the neurology for it. So when someone does something that you don't like, going to this place of right and wrong, good and bad, shouldn't, appropriate, not appropriate, they're not helpful, they're not effective, and they're also not objective and true. When we're looking for finding fault, which is what these words do, and blaming someone, what we're doing is creating an obstacle, creating a barrier to the connection with the person that has done the thing that you don't like. This is equally true with grown-ups. If somebody does something you don't like, and you go into this place of it's their fault, they should be to blame, you're not going to be able to connect with them, or they're going to be defensive and put up a wall from connecting with you. Anyway, it's a rabbit hole of disaster. shame, blame, fault finding, all of that is not going to help us. All of those are signs of closing our heart, of keeping the shield over our heart, of, some of you know the longer story, the full story of the Frog King. And in the end, the guy driving the carriage mentions that he had 3 iron bands forged around his heart to keep it from breaking. Well, we all have those bands of iron forged around our heart. That's a symptom of our time. And we have to open our heart. We have to break those bindings. We have to undefend our heart and say what's true. What's true is, I don't like when that happens. And it's when you're talking to a young child, they've done something that wasn't what you wanted them to do. If you tell them, I don't like when you blah, 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 you're getting into dangerous waters, because the child may hear it as, I don't like you. But if what it is you don't like sand to be thrown, you can say, I don't like when people throw sand. And I'm going to guess that could be true. In the initial example I gave, she doesn't like to have toys that she's playing with taken. And I'm going to guess that that's a fact, a true fact. And so if we go to this place of what we like and what we don't like, we're actually getting to the truth, to what lives in our own hearts. And that's the way we show the children how to be authentic. That's the way we show them how to be living from their heart. That's the way that we show them the truth. And I want to give you an example of what often happens. And then I'd like to leave some time for talking with. So a child does something that an adult doesn't like. What most adults do is some degree of punishment, because when somebody does something, it's their fault, they're to be blamed for it. The next step is the punishment. So the kind of worst case scenario of punishment is that somebody is physically hit. That's punishment. That's corporal punishment, it's called. Hitting somebody, that's a kind of punishment. A lesser kind of punishment is separating the person who did this thing that they should be blamed for, separating them away from you or away from the group. That's commonly called timeout. Mostly, timeout is really a punishment, because what the child most wants is the connection with the others. And perhaps the child doesn't know effective strategies for connecting with others, strategies that other people, children and adults like, so they try anything. And what they want is connecting, and what happens is they get a timeout away from everyone. So timeout, another level of punishment. A slightly lower level of punishment, equally punishment in my mind, is that someone does something you don't like and you say those words that I said we maybe don't want to use anymore. That's not good. How would you like it if she did that to you? You shouldn't have done that. All of that is a kind of punishment, a verbal punishment. Maybe it's low level punishment, but it feels terrible to have somebody talk to you like that. And another level of punishment happens instantaneously before you even say anything. When someone does something that you don't like, the way you frame it inwardly is, they shouldn't have done that. It's their fault that I'm feeling unhappy right now. And it's instantaneous. It's our reptile brain looking for fight, flight, or freeze. And it's transmitted to the young child or to a sensitive adult through little gestures that our faces make. You know, a little look in the eye or an eyebrow, or the way we hold our body. Crossing the arms is part of it. Tapping the foot, looking at the child and tapping the foot. Jutting out the lower jaw. There's so many ways. Those are bigger ways, but even subtle gesture, the child takes those in as judgment, being judged. And so what happens now? Ideally, somebody does something that you don't want, and you would like them to learn a different strategy so that they can end up with a different habit in that type of situation. That would be the ideal. So for that to happen, you have to keep your calm and say, you know, I don't like when this sort of thing happens. And the child can say, oh, okay. And they can take it in. But when we get triggered and we kind of lose the connection to our higher neurological function, and we are in our own triggered state, it's like we have become a monster. We have become the T-Rex that our ancient neurology is looking to see. Is it going to show up or not? Yes, it has shown up. We have become the T-Rex, and the child can only use the reptile brain because that's how they defend. That's survival brain. And so we wish they were going to learn to do something different in a situation like this, but instead we force them into their defensive neurology, which isn't able to learn. It's really a terrible cycle. And through this cycle, we are passing on these reactive patterns. So I just really want us to think about how neurology is the key to this. You know, there's many angles, many lenses that we can use, but if we lose our cool and are in a triggered state, a reactive state, then the child is going to fall into functioning from their reptile brain, which is fully mature at age 2, as I mentioned, and they are not going to be in a state where they can learn something. They will be in a state where they can eventually copy you, and they will develop the same trigger that you have. Finally, just as a thought, I want to offer this idea. I'll tell you a story first. My youngest daughter is named Rosemary. And when she was maybe 3 or 4 years old, well, I should preface it by saying I have a value that is, when I leave my home, I want it to be tidy so that when I return to a tidy house. So Rosemary had been playing, and there were toys scattered around the room, and I had an appointment. And I said, oh, when I noticed that my appointment meant that we had to leave the house in 5 or 10 minutes, and the toys were scattered in the room. And I stood in the middle of that room and I said, we have to go in 5 minutes. You need to put all these toys away right now. And then it was like a lightning bolt hit me in the head. And the lightning bolt said, that's not her agenda, that's your agenda. And it's true. My agenda was leaving the house tidy and leaving the house in a few minutes. Her agenda was being in the moment and playing. That's what little children do. And so probably my stress of the time of it all led to me being triggered. And also my lack of planning ahead led to me being triggered. So I kind of was blaming her for my lack of planning ahead and my need to be somewhere on time and to leave the house tidy. So that was all my agenda. Her agenda, different. But why does one agenda have any more value than another agenda? It doesn't have any more inherent value. It's just that it's my agenda. So therefore it must be important, and therefore it should be your agenda too. And that's how we interact with people a lot of the time. Humor is a good tool. Don't forget humor. It's not always serious and we have to correct things, but we can do things in a light and humor-filled way. So I just want to offer a few strategies that are not successful, that are not going to be effective, I should say, ineffective strategies. If you have the need to be right, which means you're going to look to blame somebody to find out whose fault it is, not going to end well. If your desire is to control the situation, meaning to get someone else to do something differently than they're doing it, it's not going to end well. You can never change someone else. You can change you. You have the power to change yourself, but you do not have the power to change anyone else. You can, with young children, you can offer things for them to imitate, and over time, they're very likely to imitate them. But to do that, you have to change you. Punishment and retaliation. If somebody does something that you don't like and you're going to do something equal back to them, or if they do something you don't like and you're going to punish them in a certain way, it's not going to end well. And if something happens and your strategy is just to withdraw from the situation, I didn't like that one single bit, I'm just going to go away, that's not going to end well either. They will never know that you didn't like the experience that you were having. They will never know that in this dynamic interaction between you two, you were not happy. So those strategies all not so useful, not so effective. Finally, I just want to say the things that we worry about, the things that we're anxious about, they're like the little brother and sister of fear. They're all about coldness and kind of pulling yourself inward, and they prevent you warmly reaching out to others. They cause you to put those iron bands around your heart, the shield, so that you protect your delicate little heart from dangerous hurt and threats. They prevent connection. So we have to really look at our own being and see where fears and anxieties live, because those are barriers to connecting with children. We have to find our joy. We have to reprogram ourselves to see where we can become more joyful. As Rick Hansen says, we have to hardwire happiness. We have to hardwire our own happiness, and we have to cut the wires of negativity and complaining and blaming and shaming, and those habits, those thinking habits, have been around human beings for thousands of years, and we can't change all of humanity at once, but we can change ourselves. We can create new habits, and we can create new neural patterns. And those two things are the same thing, just different words for the exact same thing. So I've been blah, blah, blahing for quite a while, and I'm wondering if anybody has questions or comments. I would be happy for you to unmute and offer whatever you would like. It's a very quiet group. Well, anyone who's interested, I'm going to put into the chat at my email address. And if you would like me to send you the slides of this, that's how you can get it. And if you have a question, it's real life situation you'd like to have a conversation about, please unmute and go for it. Okay, that's my email address. I know some of you know I have a blog. I haven't written many posts recently, but I have a fun blog, I think, with lots of tips, lots of real life situations and ideas. And I have a website. If you search my name on the internet, you'll find those things easily. So maybe I've put you all to sleep. So I hope not. I hope I've inspired you with things to think about, new ways to think about old things. And I hope you all have a good rest of your evening. And maybe I'll see you again sometime, maybe in person or on this cyber world again. So last chance, comments, questions. Otherwise, I will see you all whenever that is. Have a good evening.
Thank you so much.